My lords, ladies and gentlemen, pray silence please, because 2017 saw the arrival of a new Range Rover, and this is awfully big news. Can we cut the music please? Yes, I know this is a British car, and I'm an English journalist, so you're expecting the next few minutes to be a tear-jerking film, shot with all the pomp and ceremony of a royal wedding. I know you're expecting this video to be an outpouring of love for the new Range Rover Velar.
You see, me and my colleagues have been very familiar with the Range Rover Velar. I mean, Steve Fowler was only here just a matter of weeks ago, driving this car on these very roads here in Norway. But that was just a quick review. What I want to find out is whether this car really does deserve all the heap and praise that's been lavished upon it. And also to work out whether this car really does deserve these two words that are on the bonnet. Is it a proper Range Rover, or is it just yet another SUV?
To find out, I'm taking the Velar on a 600-kilometre road trip from Alesund to Oslo on some of Norway's most challenging roads and beautiful countryside. It should be a good test of the Velar because, according to Land Rover, it's quite unlike any other Range Rover.
So this is being billed as the most dynamic, road-biased Range Rover in the range. But I have a bit of a problem with that, because why should a Range Rover be dynamic? It doesn't need to be dynamic. It's a Range Rover, for heaven's sake. You just get the idea. You just know that this has spent hours being hurled around the Nürburgring in Germany just to shave off the odd tenth here and there, just to make it a little bit more sporty to drive. And quite frankly, it drives me mad, this. Why do cars constantly have to be sporty to drive?
Part of the problem is that the Velar isn't based on any other Range Rover. Underneath it's a Jaguar F-Pace, and we all know how much fun that is to drive.
The Velar is a Range Roverized F-Pace. It's got the same engines, that's for sure. There's 4-cylinder petrols and diesels, and there's a V6 diesel and a V6 supercharged petrol. It even uses the same 8-speed ZF automatic gearbox, for heaven's sake. Now, you sit a lot lower than you do in any other Range Rover. The seating position is lower and the centre console is a lot higher, so you feel more sporty than you do in any other Range Rover. You feel much like you do in an F-Pace or any other mid-size SUV, and that... why does a Range Rover need to feel like that? Why?
So then, we've only covered 50 miles and we've discovered the Velar is just a Range Rover version of the Jaguar F-Pace. At this rate, Land Rover is never going to talk to me again.
And now we come on to the interior, and no arguments here, it is absolutely beautiful, isn't it? Now, you've got your usual TFT dials like you get on the big Range Rover, but the real crowning glory of this car are the two screens here. Now, when you get in the car and you start it up, this one tilts forward to make it a little bit easier to look at the controls, and it's your usual In Control Pro system, so it's very easy to navigate, and it looks very nice too. But the big news is this little screen down here. It looks like a TV, doesn't it? Now, you've got access to all the car's controls, and in particular the all-terrain response system. Now, these two little knobs here control the climate control when you're in the climate setting, but when you're in another mode, such as the all-terrain response, they change their function. It's all very, very clever. One criticism I do have, though, it is when you're driving along, it is very difficult to actually use this stuff on the move. You do tend to find yourself blindly prodding around on the screen in the vain hope that you're going to click the right thing. In German rivals, it's a lot easier because you do have a rotary knob, but that is a small criticism really, because overall the quality in here is fantastic. It is such a special place to be. When I first had access to the Velar back in February, I thought there was quite a lot of space back here, but the more time I've spent with this car, I've realised it's probably a little bit tight. Now, you can probably see that seat is in my driving position, and I quite like to sit quite close to the steering wheel. But if you're 6 foot, that's going to be a lot further back, and if you've got a couple of 6 foot passengers back here, they're going to really struggle for space. Whilst there is a good rake on this back seat, I think you're going to struggle for head space. And you're not really going to be able to fit a third passenger back here because the footwells are quite small, so there's nowhere to put their feet. However, there is some nice touches back here. The row of charging ports is pretty nice, and the sense of quality back here is excellent. It's just the same as it is up in the front, and you can't say that for every single one of the Velar's rivals. It's got quite a large boot too in terms of size. It fits between the Audi Q5 and the Q7, but whilst it's a good shape and size, I don't go too much on that boot lip though.
Back on the road and heading to our overnight stop halfway through our road trip, it's fair to say the Velar isn't winning me over. Its interior is excellent, but its confused identity is annoying me. Perhaps on day 2 things will change. Day 2, and after a good night's sleep, it's time to re-evaluate the Velar. Firstly, the way it drives.
The more you drive this car, the more you realise that, so what, it may well be based on an F-Pace, and yes, it may be billed as the most dynamic Range Rover ever, but that doesn't mean that it's a bone-shaking car that's more racetrack than off-roader. This does feel like a Range Rover to drive. It doesn't feel sharp and sort of involving like an F-Pace, but that's a good thing. And you realise that Land Rover have done a very good job in distilling all of the Range Rover elements that we all love down into a smaller package. It's far more convincing than the Evoque ever has been, for that matter. One of the best things about this car is the way it rides. Now, the V6 versions come as standard with air suspension. And on this car, we've got 21-inch wheels. You can go all the way up to 22 inches if you really want to. And yes, with those large wheels, there is quite a lot of tyre roar, and you can really thump into potholes. But for the most part, the ride in this car is absolutely sensational. It really is just like the big Range Rover. It doesn't bounce around like you find on a lot of cars. There's a well-controlled little bounce in the suspension. It feels very fluid. It feels very luxurious. Now, under the bonnet of this car, we've got the supercharged V6 petrol. It's the engine that's taken straight out of the Jaguar F-Type, and whilst it's not as loud and as crackly and as poppy as the engine in the F-Type, it still makes a fantastic noise. I mean, listen to this. It sounds tremendous.
Now, most people won't be going for this engine due to its thirst for unleaded and high 214 grams per kilometre CO2 emissions. The 3-litre V6 diesel does make more sense. The 2-litre 4-cylinder engines seem out of place in such a modern-feeling luxurious SUV like the Velar, so avoid them. And the larger engines are better for towing or going off-road as well. Speaking of, while the Velar is not as country conquering like the Range Rover off-road, it's more than adequate for what the Velar is ever going to be tackling. And then we come on to the looks. There's no question here, the Velar is stunning. But be careful, because in the world of the Velar, beauty is expensive. The best looking Velar, the R-Dynamic HSE, starts at just under £53,000. But this range-topping first edition is a ridiculous £85,500.
Now, this Velar is by no means perfect, but does it feel like a Range Rover? Yes, I think it does. It does that thing which the very best Range Rovers do. It makes you feel somehow better than everybody else on the road. It makes you feel special.
And special is something that's difficult to engineer into cars. When I started out on this road trip, I was sceptical to get caught up in all the pomp around this new Range Rover. But after 600 kilometres, I can see the appeal. The interior is luxurious and modern, it drives well and it looks stunning. But most of all, it feels like a Range Rover. And that means it feels like nothing else on the road. Click the video window on the left for a walk around of the newly facelifted Range Rover, and on the right for a drag race between a Range Rover SV Autobiography and a Bentley Bentayga. Subscribe to our channel by pressing the Auto Express logo, and as always, thanks for watching.